You're listening to Mission Eve, a podcast that explores the stories of women who are opening the frontier of space to humanity. Your host is Megan Crawford, managing partner of Space Fund, a venture capital firm investing in the space industry. She is a mother, volunteer, founder, and true believer in humanity's future in space. Mission Eve is meant to inspire the girls of today who will be the women of tomorrow, leading our first permanent off-world settlements. Space needs women. Space needs you.
Hi, welcome to Mission Eve. I'm your host, Megan Crawford, and today I am thrilled to introduce Tanya Harrison.
Hello.
Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We're really glad you're here. So let's start at the beginning. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? And did that have an influence on your interest in space?
I mostly grew up in Seattle, and I don't know if living there influenced my interest in space because you don't get to see the sky a whole lot through the clouds. But my grandparents, both of my grandfathers really influenced it because one of them was interested in technology and the other one was really interested in science. And so kind of through them, I got really excited about space. And so were there any, besides your grandfathers, were there any people or kind of moments in your childhood that you remember that kind of helped you get more interested in space? Yeah, I grew up watching a lot of Star Trek with my parents. So that was a big one. I got really interested in the moon from a movie called Big Bird Goes to Japan, where he meets the Japanese princess from the moon, Kaguya Hime, that the Japanese lunar mission is named after. And after that, for some reason, I just started going out every night and staring at the sky. I just got completely fascinated. But it was when the Pathfinder mission landed on Mars in 1997, that I got really interested in Mars specifically. I saw that this lander got to Mars, it unfolded, and this little tiny rover the size of a shoebox drove out onto the Martian surface. And I thought that was just the coolest thing ever, and I knew I wanted to work on rovers after that. Awesome. So did you ever get a chance to go to space camp? No, I wish. And did you want to be an astronaut when you grew up, when you were a kid? Yeah, like when I was in maybe junior high school, I definitely looked at, going into the Air Force because I really wanted to be a shuttle commander. And then I realized I was too short to be an astronaut, and I think also too short to be a pilot. So it didn't work out very well. But I always, when I watched Star Trek, I kind of gravitated toward the chief engineers and the science officers on the show. And so that kind of led me down that path instead. So what did you study in college? And did you know what your major was going to be always, or did you? Okay. I think from the age of 10, I knew I wanted to study space. So when I went into my undergrad, I knew I wanted to work on Mars. And so I thought, well, planets are in space, I should be an astronomer. But I didn't realize until kind of the end of my junior year that if you wanted to study a specific planet like Mars, since it's a rocky planet, I should have been a geologist, not an astronomer. But by then I was so far along, I was like, well, I'll finish this astrophysics stuff and then I'll make a switch to geology in grad school. So then I switched to studying geology, specializing in Mars for my master's, worked for a few years for a space camera company, and then went back to get a PhD again in geology, focusing on Mars. So where did you go to school? Where were your colleges? I did my undergrad at the University of Washington in Seattle. So conveniently living there, UW has one of the best astronomy undergrad programs in the world. So that was nice. I did my master's at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, and then my PhD at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. Oh, Canada, fun. Yeah. Moved all over the place. That's good. And so tell me about that job you did in the middle. What was that? So I was an assistant staff scientist at a place called Malin Space Science Systems in San Diego. And it's a pretty small company. When I was there, it was about 30 people. I think now it's more like 50. And they pretty much just build cameras for NASA missions. So they built the Mars Orbiter camera on Mars Global Surveyor. They did all the color cameras on the Curiosity rover. Then they've kind of expanded a little bit. They built JunoCam on the Juno mission, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter cameras. And so my job was working with targeting mostly the context camera and the Mars Color Imager on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. So it's literally my job to pick what we got to take pictures of on Mars every day, and then look at the pictures when they came back every day from Mars, both from the standpoint of a geologist, is there anything cool in this image that we might want to get more data from, get stereo, do some science. I did write some papers while I was there. And also from an engineering standpoint, is there anything weird about this image that might tell you that the camera is not functioning properly? Never ran into that, which was good. But it was pretty great because a lot of the time you were the first human to ever see this piece of Mars that you commanded an image of from a spacecraft. But that's just blows my mind even now.
That's really cool. Yeah, it is really cool. And so what kind of science were you doing? What kind of papers did you write?
Usually when people are doing research, they focus on like one specific area geographically or one specific type of feature, like they'll focus on impact craters or volcanoes. But since I was getting to look at the entire planet every day, like every CTX image is about 30 kilometers wide and 120 kilometers long, and we were covering humongous swaths of the planet. So I was getting to look at everything. So I kind of just went down the rabbit hole of anything that I thought was cool and interesting coming through the images. So I wrote one paper on, I discovered a huge network of outflow channels near one of the youngest large impact basins on Mars, a crater called Leo up in the northern flat lowland areas. And we didn't really image a lot up there because if you look at a map of Mars, the northern plains look pretty boring. There's not a lot there, not a lot of craters, not a lot of anything. But it was one of the days that we had a lot of extra, we call it downlink space. So Mars was pretty close to Earth. We could get a couple hundred images a day. When Mars is really far away, sometimes we get 2 to 4 a day if it's like not a great time. So we were just trying to fill up all the space we could. So I put a bunch of stuff in the northern plains and suddenly found this humongous network of channels. So that told us that there was liquid water or a lot of ice, one of the two, in this area of Mars in sort of the geologically youthful past when this impact crater formed and just liberated all this water onto the surface. I also did some stuff looking at volcanic features in an area where we'd never identified any volcanic features before. And then the main bulk of my work ended up being on Martian gullies, which are these small channels, mostly on the walls of craters in the middle and high latitudes, that have been kind of an enigma because they're very geologically young, like tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years old. And they look like features on Earth that are carved by liquid water. But in the last 10,000 to 100,000 years on Mars, liquid water shouldn't have been stable on the surface for any extended period of time, like maybe a few hours at the most. So we've been trying to just figure out, ever since these were discovered back in the late 90s, how they could have formed under these conditions on Mars. And so I went through and I mapped out every single gully on the planet. And then I continued those studies when I left that job to go do my PhD to try and figure out more about what is the geographic distribution of these telling us about how they might have formed.
Awesome.
That was a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Really cool stuff, though. And to be kind of, like you said, the first person to see these images as they came down, that's fantastic. So what did you do after your PhD?
My goal had been to go get the PhD and then kind of go back to work in mission operations. So Malin was a subcontractor for JPL. So kind of like all the space nerds' dreams, I wanted to go work at JPL. But about a year before I was supposed to finish my PhD, Arizona State University called me up kind of out of the blue and offered me a job. And they said, well, the catch is you have to graduate by the summer. So I'm like, well, I can finish my PhD in 4 months instead of a year. Why not? So I didn't sleep for 4 months. I finished a PhD. And then I left to go work for this group called the Space Technology and Science Initiative, or the New Space Initiative for short, at ASU. And I was the director of research. So my role ended up being this interesting hybrid of industry, business development type stuff, and still getting to do some research. So I worked in operations for the color cameras on the Opportunity rover, continued some of the stuff that I've been doing for my PhD in terms of Mars and gullies related to some ice stuff. But the goal of the New Space Initiative was to create partnerships between ASU and sort of the entrepreneurial space sector. So the SpaceX's, the Virgins, Planet Labs, stuff like that, to get them to collaborate with the university in a way that kind of changes the dynamic of how universities tend to approach companies. So generally the university's like, oh, sponsor us to get your name on a lab or give us some jobs for our students. This was more like, here's a proposal call from NASA. We would like you guys to be on the proposal with us so that at the end of the day, we're all making money. We're not like going and asking for handouts or anything. And then hopefully from that, we're getting technology development or scientific advances. And it was kind of a pilot project from the university. So once after SpaceX first docked with the space station, there was a recognition that, the space industry is changing. We should find some way to take advantage of that. And a few years later, they decided to launch this initiative to see, is there a way we can get these companies to want to engage with universities or recognize how we can help them? If you have a small company that doesn't know how to approach NASA or how to craft their proposals in a strong way to be competitive against the companies that have traditionally gotten these grants in the past, they might not have a great fighting chance because a lot of the contracts tend to go to the same people over and over again. But ASU's had a really long track record in terms of space technology and science wins. And so our hope was that if we brought that expertise together with these companies, it would kind of help give them a leg up in the proposal winning process. And we did have some nice successful wins with some small like CubeSat companies and some other tech development folks that maybe didn't know how they could approach NASA on their own.
Excellent. So it sounds like that initiative worked. Is it still going on?
Yeah, it's still going on. They're still working to see what more they can do. I think this is like the final year of their pilot funding. So then the university will come in and kind of analyze how they think that it performed over the last 5 years.
And how long were you there?
I was there for 3 years. So I came in a little past the first year, I think, when it started.
Awesome. And then where'd you go from there?
I guess it was another poaching process in the middle of, so the job was kind of sold to me by the person that had the position before me. He got promoted to full professor, so they needed to fill his position. And they said, well, we need somebody that's really business minded, and maybe doesn't necessarily want to go the traditional academic track. And this person and I had actually both worked at Malin before. And he said, well, I know Tanya is really interested in sort of the industry side, so maybe she would be good for this. So he said, well, this is a really great way to kind of survey the new space industry and see what might be out there that you would want to do. And when your PhD is in Mars, you tend to feel like your job options are quite limited. So I didn't know if there was a commercial company out there I could work with. But Planet Labs was one of the first companies that I got to interact with through New Space when they came to ASU. And I immediately fell in love with what they were doing, because when I was doing stuff for Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, separate from the taking images with the context camera, we were taking daily global color views of Mars with the Mars Color Imager to monitor change, mostly with weather, but we could also see surface pattern changes as well. And planets doing similar things, imaging the Earth every single day at much higher resolution than Marcy does. But the fact that they were doing this global change detection really caught my interest. And so I kind of was a groupie for a couple of years, just like using their data for science, but also trying to figure out, like, how do you get into this very like aerospace tech minded company as a scientist? And then eventually a position sort of formed organically where they could use a scientist. And so they called me one day and were like, well, hey, we have this position that might be of interest. Like, would you be willing to leave Mars for Earth? And I said, yeah, I think I could do that for a little bit. So now I've always been known as Tanya of Mars. So there's a little bit of an identity crisis now that my job is focused on Earth.
So tell me about your job at Planet, and tell us about Planet, what they do, and how you fit in.
So Planet operates the largest constellation of satellites in Earth orbit. We have about 150 little 3U CubeSats, so they're about this big. And then we have...
For those who are listening, how big is this big?
Sorry, it's about the size of a loaf of bread. So you could hold it in your hands, which is pretty amazing because a traditional satellite is the size of a minivan or a school bus. And we have 150 of them that are just orbiting the Earth basically in a line. And we take advantage of the fact that the Earth is rotating underneath that line to build up daily global coverage of the entire landmass of the Earth at 3-meter resolution. So that means we can resolve things on the ground that are about 9 meters in any given like length or width dimension. And the goal of this is to see change on rapid timescales so that you can try to make actionable decisions from that. And I thought that was a really powerful thing to try and do for the Earth, so that we can actually see how what we're doing on like human timescales is actually affecting our planet, which we don't always get a really good concept of with images that you might only see every month or every year or something like that. My role is that I'm the manager of science programs. So my goal is to get more scientists to use this data as a scientist so I can nerd out with other scientists and figure out, okay, what exactly are you doing? Oh, you're doing cryosphere studies of this particular place in Alaska. Here's the data set that we have that could help you. Here's how to get it. Here's how to process it. Here's how it ties into everything that you're trying to do. So we can have a more in-depth discussion than just saying, well, here's some data. It would be really great for what you're doing. We can actually help them figure out how to use it.
So it's almost like a business development role where you're spending a lot of time with customers and trying to get new customers for Planet.
Yeah, so it's definitely not a scientific research position. I theoretically could do research with the people that we're collaborating with. I know the person in my role previously did a little bit of that, but that's not the focus of the role. So again, it's a little bit of an identity shift from like a research scientist to this hybrid research biz dev role to a full business development role.
So tell me what your day's like day to day when you're not traveling and going to conferences and all the rest. What does a typical day look like for you?
A lot of it is trying to figure out like what kind of tools do we need to make the data easier to handle, because there's a lot of it. We're getting 11 terabytes of data every single day from all the satellites. And that's like drinking from a fire hose for a lot of scientists who are used to having, a couple images a month or maybe a handful of images over the course of years if they are working on an area that's particularly remote or really cloudy a lot of the time. They just might not have a lot of usable data. And so trying to figure out, how do you sort through this? How do you parse it? How do you deliver it to a person in a way that they can handle getting that much data from you?
And you certainly can't send it as an email attachment, right?
Yeah. And we don't want to just mail hard drives continuously. Right. So we're trying to figure out how best to take advantage of things like that, because the time stack of this data set is really what the revolutionary part about it is. There are satellites out there that take higher spatial resolution data, and there are some other satellites like NASA's Landsat that take more spectral bands, but you don't have anything that's getting you this daily coverage at pretty high resolution. So figuring out how to serve that whole time stack when you say, oh, the area that you want to study, we have 1,200 images of that area over the last, X number of years, that can be a lot for people to try and handle.
What advice would you give someone? What advice would you give a woman or just a young person who's interested in getting into the new space industry? What have you learned about how you kind of got into it this circuitous way? But if others wanting to break in, what would be your advice?
I would say kind of survey the landscape and figure out who's doing what are the things that interest you the most. And then you can pick sort of your course of study based on that. So if you're really interested in propulsion systems, for example, you can see the handful of companies out there that are working on that and tailor your studies in that direction. If you're not quite sure what you want to do, looking at what the companies are doing can also help you hone in on that interest. Because if you just say, well, I love space, that's very broad, right? But if there's something that a particular company is doing that you're like, oh, I think that air launch system that Virgin is trying seems really cool. Maybe I should learn more about that. But then tied to that is definitely the networking aspect. It's really a lot about who you know and getting connected with the right people. So coming to conferences where you can meet people that work at the companies that you're interested in, I think especially in this industry is incredibly valuable. It's good to just get some face time so that when you do apply for something, you're not just a name on a piece of paper that they can't associate with a real human. And when they meet you, you can effuse enthusiasm at them. And that makes you really memorable later to be like, oh, I met this person at this conference and like their enthusiasm for space was just infectious. We definitely want them on the team.
Great advice. So have you had any challenges as a woman, either in your studies or in your career, just by being a woman in such a kind of male-dominated industry, and obviously the science fields that you were in were probably fairly male dominated as well?
Definitely. My first job out of college, like between master's and PhD, there were a lot of problems there with harassment to the point where I literally applied for a job at Starbucks to get out of there because I wanted to stay physically where I was living, but I was just like, I can't put up with this situation anymore. The coolness of the job is not worth the way I'm being treated. And that was really disheartening because it killed a lot of my enthusiasm for space. And I had always been this very like bright, bubbly, happy person. And by the time I left, the person that I was living with said, I can't even remember the last time I saw you smile. And that was the moment that I realized, like, I have to get out of this situation because I'm not the person that I used to be. And this enthusiasm for space has been literally like my entire life. It's who I am. So I needed to get that back. And then when I went to my PhD program, that was a really great transition because it was an incredibly supportive environment. For the first time, it was female dominated. Most of the people in my lab group were women. My advisor was male, but he cultivated this really great family atmosphere where we were all really supportive of each other. And like, I still talk to all of those people every single week. Like, we're super, super close. And then transitioning back into sort of a mixing with industry role, it's definitely difficult as a woman who was associated with the university and also looks very young. I would go out to conferences and they would see me and then see that my name tag said I was associated with the university and just immediately assume that I was a student. And so it would change the dynamic of the conversations. And so I found myself thinking more about how I needed to enter a conversation or even enter a room, trying to dress a little bit more authoritatively. Is that a good word? And, I'd always felt pretentious putting doctor on my name, even though I have a PhD. And I realized, no, I need to set those expectations and the realization of what I'm bringing to the table right at the beginning. And so I put it on my business cards. I put it on my Twitter. Like, I put it out there, and it still feels a little uncomfortable, even though it's been a few years since I graduated. But I'm trying to sort of internalize, like, no, you worked for this, you own it. And it's translating to other people as well. I was just at an event last night where I was speaking to a woman who looked at my Twitter on her phone because she wanted to follow me. And she said, "Oh, you have doctor on there. I don't put that on mine. I never thought about it." And I explained this reasoning to her. And she's like, "Oh, that makes so much sense. I'm going to change mine." And she changed it right there. So it's cool to see that, like, this kind of thing, something that small, can influence the way that somebody thinks about themselves and what expertise they bring to the field.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. That's a fantastic point. And I know that there's a lot of women who are insecure and who don't necessarily want to shout from the rooftops what their qualifications are, and they feel like they're bragging about themselves if they do. But you did earn it. You did earn that PhD. So yes. So I should have introduced you as Dr. Tanya Harrison. I'm sorry.
See, I didn't even notice because I don't think about it that much. But yeah, I counsel students on that, not even students, my friends on this a lot. A friend of mine was trying to write a biography that she was giving to a conference for a panel she was going to be on. And it sounded very reserved, but she's made some significant contributions to our field. And, they asked, one of the things was, what awards or accomplishments have you made? And I pointed out to her, well, you made this massive discovery that is kind of like the thing that you're famous for. She said, well, no, it feels too self-congratulatory to put that in there. I was like, but it's not like you're bringing it up at a party. You're not introducing yourself that way. Right. This is in a professional setting where you're explaining why you have the credentials that made them want to put you on this panel in the first place. And I just run into that a lot. Like, it seems like women definitely want to downplay their expertise, and it's good to be humble, but right. There's a time and place for when you should be highlighting these things that you are capable of and what you've done.
That's a great message. And I think that everybody needs to hear that. So thank you. So what are your long-term career goals? Where do you see yourself in 10 or 20 years? Maybe going back to science, or are you happy in the commercial world?
I'm not sure. My goal ever since I was a kid, I think, like, right after I saw Sojourner driving on the surface, I learned about how missions worked. And my goal at that point was to be the first female principal investigator of a mission to Mars. That was over 20 years ago. There has still never been a woman that has been the principal investigator of a mission to Mars. And wow. I was sure even at that point, I was like, well, I'm never going to be the first because it's so long from now. And usually to be a PI, you're generally more senior in your career, maybe like 40s, 50s, certainly not when you're in your 20s or 30s. So I was like, well, that's what I want, but it's never going to happen. I think even up until this point, until the Mars 2020 rover, we'd never even had a woman that was the principal investigator of an instrument on a mission to go to Mars. There's a lot of instruments on these missions, so I was kind of surprised. But then I saw all of the things that go into being a principal investigator. And it's not a role that you go into if you want good work-life balance. And as I've gotten older, I've started to appreciate that a little bit more and realize, if I want to actually spend time with my family, I have to be able to sleep and have weekends. And it made me sort of readjust my life priorities a little bit. And then coming into industry and seeing how differently everything operates. I feel like there's so much more room for rapid career advancement compared to academia, where you have to just put in all these years and hope you get tenure, and the funding opportunities are so limited that it doesn't matter how good you are as a scientist. You're competing against hundreds of other fantastic scientists for a very limited pot of money. And so a lot of people just are constantly struggling no matter how good they are at their job, because there's just not funding out there. Whereas if you're doing well in a company, provided the company is doing well, generally, you'll be okay. You have a set salary. You have more opportunity to maybe get raises or bonuses or title advancement. And that I found that really appealing, to be able to be a little bit more recognized for your ability rather than just kind of almost a luck of the draw in academia a lot of the time.
So you probably stay in industry then. Sounds like you're leaning that way.
I think so. I'd love to stay in industry, but also find a way to incorporate Mars back in, or do Mars more on the side. Like, I still have Mars projects that are kind of brewing things that are completely separate from what Planet's doing. But I do miss getting up and like thinking, I'm going to work on a rover today. So that part's a little bit sad, but now I get to work with 150 other satellites that are adorable. So it's still a pretty good job. I can't complain.
I don't think I've ever heard a satellite called adorable before. I really like that. So most of us who are in this industry are really true believers, right? And in space, in humanity's future in space, and I find that a lot of people are involved in other things outside of work, organizations, nonprofits. You were mentioning you got some side projects. So what do you do outside of work to help kind of push humanity's future in space forward?
A lot of what I do is I do a lot of science communication. So I'm really active on Twitter, trying to convey in very digestible messages to people things about like, why are we doing Mars exploration? What does that actually entail? How does that benefit us economically? What is it like being a woman in the field? How can you get into the field? Any of that kind of stuff. And I've tried to be very open and accessible so that people can ask any type of question that they want and not feel like it's a stupid question or feel like they might be talked down to by giving them an answer. I'm also a really big advocate for, mostly on Twitter, for helping people with disabilities get into the sciences. I have a condition called ankylosing spondylitis that caused me a lot of trouble. Even like I wasn't even sure I would be able to graduate from college because I spent so much time in the hospital. It was a humongous impediment to getting anything else done. I mean, even now it's still incredibly difficult some days. But for me, like, Stephen Hawking was actually my biggest role model, because for a while I was in a wheelchair and I would have a lot of motivation issues, like going to class. And I would think, well, if Stephen Hawking can get in his wheelchair and teach a class, like you can get you can get in your wheelchair and go to your physics class. So that was like something that I kept in mind. But then as I got older, I realized he was my only role model. And I definitely identified more with being limited by a disability than I did being limited as a woman, because that felt like it was definitely stronger in terms of holding me back from what I wanted to do. And so I try to be really open on Twitter about things like, I have to go into the Mayo Clinic every 6 weeks for like an IV infusion. And so I always post pictures from that, usually with like a thumbs up or a thumbs down on how I'm feeling that day. So and then it helps people ask questions too about this disease that is very rare. So not a lot of people have heard of it. And just show like, yeah, you can be sick, but still do all these other things. And I think I love space so much that it makes me want to push past feeling really terrible a lot of days. So that's good. And if that can help other people who have that passion and they're not sure if they can follow it, I want them to know that it's something they can do. I'm the youngest member of the National Space Society's Board of Governors to try. I forget about that sometimes. So the goal there is to try and figure out how we can pivot this institution to communicate better with like the younger generation, because there's certainly an age divide in the membership there. And the National Space Society chapter in Seattle was actually really helpful to me getting into this as a career. When I was maybe 13, 14 or so, I approached the local chapter in Seattle and was asking for ways to get connected with companies in the Seattle area where I could do job shadowing or internships, and who to talk to at the university to work on research projects with. And so it felt really great when they approached me for this governor's position. They didn't even know when they asked me that this was a huge part of my backstory. And so I said, yeah, I would be really passionate about trying to give back to this group that helped me out so much. So I'd love to figure out how NSS can communicate better with, like, what can we do to serve like this next generation of folks in space? Those are the big things. I also do a lot of random stuff. Like I make space t-shirts that I sell and like pass out stickers and swag and stuff to folks like my nurses at the Mayo Clinic or my Uber drivers or flight attendants to sort of get them encouraged by asking questions about space. Because as soon as you tell somebody you work in the space industry, especially when I worked on Mars rovers, tons of questions come out. And they're generally really good questions too. So it's a nice way to initiate a conversation. And then at the end, just leave them with like a little NASA sticker or something to be like, thanks for asking questions.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And tell everybody your Twitter handle so they can follow you and all your adventures.
So my Twitter handle is Tanya of Mars. You can find me pretty much anywhere on the internet as that, like blogging on Medium and Instagram and stuff like that. Perfect.
What do you do for fun when you're not at work and when you're not out there championing the space industry to flight attendants and Uber drivers, which I love? What do you do for fun?
I feel like the answer to that question makes me really boring because pretty much everything I do is space. So it feels very one-dimensional. I am also a photographer, so I do like to go out and shoot pictures. So I like to say I work on space cameras and Earth cameras. But really, pretty much everything I do is space in some fashion. Maybe I should learn how to balance that out a little better by, I don't know, learning how to knit or something. But that would involve having free time.
I feel you, though. My life is the same way. It's space all the time. My kids don't even... Normally, kids are very inspired by space. My kids are like, oh, not again, Mom. You know?
They're just sick of it. Yeah. They just want to study like the bottom of the ocean just to get as far away from space as possible.
Exactly. So I feel you on that one. Okay, last question that we ask everybody. When it comes time to settle space, will you be among the first to go?
Oh, idealistically, yes. Practically, probably not, because I'm super claustrophobic, so I really hate even riding on airplanes. But once I sat in the crew capsule that Blue Origin is developing, I didn't feel claustrophobic in there, so maybe I could go if I was riding on Blue.
Excellent.
This is not product placement for Blue. I do not work for them. I just really like the capsule.
And it's exciting that you got to sit in it. That's really fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. Really appreciate it. Really loved hearing your story.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Mission Eve is a production of the Center for Space, Commerce, and Finance, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating entrepreneurs and investors about their respective challenges and opportunities as it relates to space. Megan Crawford has been your host and executive producer. Aaron Pagel is the executive director for the center and producer and editor for this episode. Marketing and communications for Mission Eve is managed by Nikki Martinez. Theme music has been composed by Liz Fohl. If you'd like to support this podcast, please visit patreon.com/missioneve to become a monthly subscriber. We have multiple tiers available with benefits like personalized thank yous, access to limited edition t-shirts, opportunities to engage with our interviewees via online Ask Me Anything sessions, and small group gatherings with Megan Crawford when available. Any support you can offer will go a long way to helping us continue to tell the stories of the women who are making life in space a reality. Please follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Center for Space Commerce and Finance, Twitter at CSCF_nonprofit, and LinkedIn at linkedin.com/company/CSCF. Thank you very much for listening.